Best Practices and Workflow webinar. This is Stephanie Miller from NPR Digital Services, and we're excited to bring this conversation to all of you today. We have in-house Jennifer Strachan, who has been working with us and fellow stations regarding NPR One and local content. We also have a couple of guest speakers, Juliet Fromholtz from WYSO, as well as Jenna Montgomery from KUOW, will be joining us in the conversation to talk about experiences that they've had at their stations. Also joining us on the line is Sarah Sorensen from NPR, and we'll be talking a lot about local content and workflow specifically. Thank you all for the mic check earlier. Just a couple of notes. As you know, there's a Q&A box in the GoToWebinar panel. This is where you can ask questions throughout. We'll be monitoring those questions, and we'll be stopping or pausing periodically as we go if they relate to the section we're in, but we're really holding off until the end for questions. All of this information will be posted on nprstations.org, as well as any support information, onboarding information, or questions that you may have regarding this experience. So with that, I want to introduce Jennifer Strachan to the table.
Take it away.
Take it away.
Hi, everybody. Today we're going to go through just a couple of things. We're going to start at the very beginning and just kind of do some quick reviews. We're going to look at what the flow is, and I'll explain kind of why we call it that for those of you who haven't heard of it. We're going to look at some of our editorial recommendations that we distributed last summer, just review those quickly. But the biggest chunk of what we want to do today is talk about workflow and how different stations are handling that, the different approaches people are taking, how that's going. And then toward the end, I know Janine is going to give you a few updates on their side, from the Station Connect side, and we're going to take your questions. So for me, I wanted to just kind of give you a little background in kind of what I've been doing, and that's really involved a lot of conversations. I've been listening to a lot of you and kind of your experience with NPR One, what your audience is thinking, talking a lot with NPR, obviously, giving them some information back. So I've been kind of in the middle, shepherding some of that information back and forth. It's been really interesting. And so for today's conversation, we're really focusing on two main parts of the content experience, and those are newscasts and local segments. So that's not all of the local content that's in NPR One. There are other things such as pledge messages and sonic IDs and hellos and some other things. But for today's conversation, I'm really kind of honing in on those two areas from the editorial side. So just know if you have other questions about those, there are other opportunities to learn more about that, but this is the focus of today. Excuse me. One of the things we like to talk about when we're talking about this project generally is a reminder about kind of the testing and learning phase. And Sarah, who really is on the editorial lead on this project, likes to say that we've been doing radio for decades, but we've only been doing NPR One for months. And that's just a reminder when we think about all that we're trying to understand. And that's both understand what our audience thinks of the product and of the content, but also what stations are thinking. So it's really a very early stage in the process. And so we always kind of approach it as we're in the beginning phases of starting to adjust and adapt, and we're really in a testing and learning phase. So just a reminder there. I wanted to revisit the flow, and a lot of people don't understand exactly how NPR One gets programmed and how that works. And this is a term that's come up. They call it the flow, people call it a rundown, a lot of different terms, but the flow basically exists in the way I'm talking about it is between two different things. And one is it's managed by real people and editors, so there's a little bit of high touch from a group of editors at NPR, but then it's also managed by a computer and uses computer learning. So it's the combination of those two things that we feel like makes NPR One different. And so it's really that personal touch, the editorial touch that I'm going to talk about here as far as the flow. So when you think about how do stories get into NPR One. So think about it like this. There's a group of stories that just exist on any given day. And the team at NPR, the editorial team, takes a look at those stories and say, okay, this is the stories we have today, and what kind of stories are those? So they put them into different collections based on tone. So Invest, for example, could be a deeper news story. Break could be something that's a little lighter with more sound-rich texture. So they break them in these different collections to kind of know what types of stories they are. So that's really the personal editorial touch that's happening at NPR. From there, the computer takes over, which is basically a set of instructions that we call the flow. And so the computer then goes to the different collections, pulls stories from there, and then puts it into these different categories in the flow. And that's kind of our idea of a rundown. And then it distributes that particular flow out to the listener. Now, the important part about the flow is the flow is always changing, and we're constantly doing testing. And I've heard a lot of people ask about this, so I think it's important to understand that there are a variety of different flows that are out there at any given point. So your experience may be different than your neighbor's. What you heard today at that particular time might be different than someone else. And that's just really about that testing and learning phase, and about trying to understand a variety of ways in which people are liking the content, are engaging with it. So just when you're listening and when you're thinking about it, know that flow is shifting all the time. Things are going up and down and around, and that has to do with a lot of other elements in there as well. So one of the things I know some of you have heard already is that we absolutely know now we have data that tells us that local content absolutely does matter to the listeners. And the biggest reason we know is around the local newscast specifically. And that's where we have the most information, because that is the most common content that we have in there so far from stations. And the very first thing that you may have heard is that it is the least skipped thing above all other content, including the national newscast. So people really are interested and they're invested in it, and it's popular in that way. The other thing that we've also come to understand is that the more the stations that have local newscasts have lower attrition rates. So that seems to be an important point that we're noticing now. It's something that when stations have local content, people are sticking around longer. And I'll also note that at the national level, they hear through social media channels and so forth from people in local areas saying, hey, where's my local content? I was looking for it. I didn't see it. Where is it? So they definitely are interested. They definitely want it. And now the data shows that they are liking it. So that's really good news. So just going back then to some of our recommendations from the beginning of the project that many of you may have not seen yet. And all of these are in Station Connect and on NPR Digital Services to take another look at. But there's a couple of key things that I wanted to review here that are important. One of the biggest things that we've talked with a lot of stations about, and one of the things Digital Services has worked with many on, is the idea of clean cuts. And so what that means basically is when you are, whether through automation or other means, taking your newscast out, what's happened a lot to stations is that there's something that's hanging over either the end, it's not cut cleanly at the end, or maybe you get a piece of morning edition at the beginning. And so making sure that your newscast has clean cuts is just critical for the listening experience, because you can imagine you're going through, the second a listener gets to it and it seems like something's wrong, they're going to skip it. So we feel about as strongly about this one as any of the rest, but it's critical to being in and having a good experience. After that, as far as length, right now, our recommendation is the same that mirror the magazine clocks. Right now, the maximum length is 6 minutes for newscasts. That may or may not change later, but for now, that's our recommendation. We, of course, want the newscaster to identify him or herself in the station at the beginning of the newscast, and that seems like, well, of course, but the way some of the newscasts are being cut, you just really want to make sure that to think about your listener dropping into this experience, right? So when you hear it, would this listener know that I'm listening to your station and that this is the host? So that's certainly important. And then we talk about a clean, news-centric experience free of extra or dated elements. And really what we mean by that are three things. The biggest being no time check. So many stations, just as part of their regular editorial process, they do it's 8:04, here we are. And you can imagine even if that was only played at 8:20 or 8:40, it's still what we know is it sounds wrong to the listener in a segmented audio experience. So as much as we think, well, that news is still relevant, the timestamp itself actually dates it. And so we don't want the listener to ever think, oh, I'm behind, I don't have the most recent newscast. So just by eliminating that element, we can really change some of that. The other parts are traffic, which of course, if you have that in your newscast and you're not updating your newscast regularly, then that can date the experience for people, and it can, would obviously be impactful to anybody who's listening to that much later than they need to. And the sponsorship piece is really around, we have to remember now that we're putting control in the hands of the user. And so anything in there where they think, oh, I don't know if I want to hear this, now we've given them the option to skip. So we don't want them to skip the newscast. And that sponsorship opportunity later, right now the national sponsorships are in there, but we're going to have local sponsorship opportunities that will not be able to be skipped. So we kind of want to reserve that for those opportunities and not have them here in the newscast. So when we get to local segments, some of our recommendations, there are a couple of really key things. One of them was around the intro. And the very easiest way of saying this is make sure there is one. A lot of times, I think prior to this project or when you've been putting your digital audio online, it's been just the standalone story. So in a segmented audio experience, when you're dropping in without the intro, it doesn't make sense. So we want to make sure we're including the intro with the story, that it's identifiable with the station. And that's a little bit of an adjustment for some stations because you're not necessarily saying your call letters at the head of that intro because normally the host doesn't need to say that. So that's a little bit of an interesting adjustment that I've noticed when you're listening, because sometimes you drop into a story, it's a local story, but it takes me a minute, even if it's a good intro, to go, oh, okay, wait, oh, I'm in Boston now, because they didn't identify it was Boston, even if I could probably recognize the host. So that's something to think about. And this is all about what you know how to do in radio, which is sell the story, right? Make it good. Make sure that that intro is really pulling people in. Because of this reason, what we know now is that most of the skips happen within the first 20 to 25 seconds. The next stop in is really 2 minutes when they start to skip. So what we like to say is, these are all, what we know from radio, which is sell it hard early, and then give them something to stick around for. But that becomes critical, right, in those first 20 to 25 seconds, because just like a good headline helps people decide whether to go further, this intro now is going to mean, do I skip or do I stay around? So that's critical, those intros. So along with that, thinking about those segments and the time, right, that we know length matters, that the shorter the story, the fewer the skips, and the data has already shown this. Somewhere in the sweet spot of 2:30 and less are the ones that perform the best. That doesn't mean that has to be what you put in. We're just saying the shorter ones do really well, the longer ones not as well. So optimal length, somewhere between 2 and 5, and we have in there right now a maximum length of 12 minutes. So when you're thinking about, where is my story and how is it positioned in that flow, shorter play earlier, longer play later, and that's just based on what we know from users. We know now that there's an experience that they expect that causes them to stick around versus leave. And that means they want it a little quicker up front, and then when they're invested, then they're ready for those longer stories. But that's actually something that's being tested right now. They're trying out new ways of, well, all right, well, let's try and put something longer up top. Let's experiment with that. But right now, those things are playing later in the flow. And again, just speaking of time, those pieces with time references in your local content will be outdated. Boy, there's a big rally at the stadium this weekend, and then that piece sits in there for 4 days. Just be mindful of that, especially around the holidays. It's one of those things, if you're saying something that has a very direct reference that's going to be dated shortly, it's just something to think about when you're putting your content in. So really important on this point, we've been hearing a lot of really great feedback from you, and I've heard this from a lot of different people, and I've been talking with NPR about it. And these, I would really categorize the overall thinking is kind of goes into these 4 categories of what I've heard the most. There's certainly been a lot of other things. which is timely news, spot news, then is outdated quickly, but also you can't have anything in longer where you might have an evergreen piece that you'd like to keep in for, months at a time. So we really heard that, and NPR, I can tell you, is working on that one right as we speak, to be able to give you the ability to say, I want this one to stay in for today, or this week, or 3 months. We're not sure exactly how it will look, but that is coming. The other thing we've heard is expiration time and length of newscasts, that people would like to be able to say when their newscast expires. Not all markets produce the same number of newscasts. And for some markets, it may be something where a newscast can last longer than others. Right now, it expires after 2 hours. Can we do something where we give stations control over that? We're looking at that right now. The third one is really around allowing you the ability to tag for tone or classify your content. So you remember that those first couple of slides around how the flow works in those categories. So local content right now is all put into one big category. So we don't know whether your piece is that a hard news piece? Is that a piece on the Christmas lights parade? And that's been causing a few issues with kind of that back-to-back butting up against something in the flow that, that's a rough transition. And I think everybody would like to do something about that in the long run, right? Being able to say, this is a lighter piece, this is a heavier piece, and start to change the flow to better serve the user. So that is something we'd like to see that we've heard from you. And then finally, the ability, we've heard this from several people, and this is really a tools thing, is we'd love to be able to just see all the content we have in NPR One, maybe a dashboard of some kind. That's certainly a valid idea and a good question. There's teams here that have been thinking about that for some time. So these are all, I would say, these are all here. They've been heard. They're being talked about as we speak. And if you have others, this is partly what I've been doing is hearing back from you. What other things are you seeing that you might need that you would imagine would make it easier for you? So those things are coming. So talking about workflow, that was a big part of what I just concluded. And I had a group that I asked to help me with this a little bit, of stations who were already in, I think, at least one who is just coming in. And I wanted to hear a little bit more specifically about how has this been going? How have they worked at their station to change or not change maybe their workflow? And what challenges have they come up against? And what does that look like? So they were really great at helping me think through some of the things that I had already heard from stations and how it's working for them. So one of the things I just thought was interesting was this surprise of who it was easiest for or not quite as easy for. And really it came out in a lot of other conversations I had, and certainly with this group, where it looks like, just from my conversations, that those middle-sized stations are actually, it's been slightly easier for them. So it's not saying that it's been too far skewed on one end or the other with the large or small, but what I think happens with these really, kind of medium-sized stations is they're able to move and adjust a little easier than some smaller stations or larger stations who have multiple departments, a lot of projects. It's kind of interesting to note that there's a large portion in the middle who have found it to be not quite as challenging as you'd imagine. So I thought that was interesting. One of the questions I asked, just because we're pretty, we feel very strongly about the idea of listening to the experience at the local level, because we really want to hear, we want to hear feedback, but as radio people, of course, we want to know, how does this sound to you? How is it sounding in your local market? What do you think? And I'm really encouraging everybody to listen. So right now, I guess my overall assessment would be that it's primarily digital editors, some upper management folks kind of out of curiosity, some people in the newsroom, but it's not really a part of the day-to-day conversations. And I don't know that there's anything to say about that, except to say it's not typically, hasn't been widespread listening at this point. And that would be something that we would love to see, just at least more people getting in there, listening, and offering up their thoughts and ideas. So workflow, when we look at newscasts, there's a couple of things a couple of ways that people are doing that technically. They're either doing that through pure automation, which is really it's just grabbing the newscast with little or no extra touch. Some people actually previously pre-recorded their newscast, and so that made it easier. And so I would say, pros and cons, there's a little bit, less impact to staff of just doing pure automation. But the cons of doing that, from my perspective, are, you don't have as much daily quality control. So those you get some, iffy cuts, or editorial control. Maybe there's something that you would have changed or cut out that you couldn't do that way. The other group is kind of doing some automation plus light editing, which is daily attention. It's kind of cutting off. I don't know if it's cutting off there. Janine's going to look at this for me. Daily attention to just basically trimming up that newscast and making it a little bit, just having a little bit more of that sense of, I know exactly what's going in. I've had a little bit of a touch. Obviously, that means a little bit more staff investment, but it also means a little bit more editorial control. Let's see how the next one looks. It's cutting me off here a little bit. So, did you just stop it? No? Okay. So one of the things I noticed is that not too many people have changed their editorial process because of the newscast piece specifically. So when we talked to a variety of different people, most people said, this was pretty easy as far as just grabbing the newscast and dropping the time reference. I put not a problem, question mark. The people I've talked to haven't felt like that was a big deal, that letting go of that time stamp was not necessarily a problem, and some are looking at easy ways to change that.
So can we throw a quick question in before we continue?
Yeah.
Bill Thomas has a great question. Can you explain, what do you define as a medium-sized station, just to give us some frame of reference?
Right. So this is a good one. And I guess what I would say is those stations with some newsroom capacity, and between that, and I don't want to put a number on it necessarily, but I would say those who have more than, they have someone in the newsroom up to the very largest. I think we all probably know what the very largest of stations are, but medium-sized mean they have some newsroom capacity, ability to create content. I guess that's where I would put them. The very smallest, of course, don't have the ability to create their own content or don't have a news staff. So I guess for the purposes of this conversation, that's how I would clarify.
Excellent. Thank you.
Okay. So when we look at workflow and local segments, there's really two primary processes and the way people are getting in their local segments. The first is that people are producing a separate intro that's then added to the local segment. And that's interesting. There's a lot of different stations who are doing that. Who is doing that at the stations? Other reporters, editors, but the interesting thing is they're not all broadcast. So that's been interesting to talk to those stations who there's a variety of people who might be reading the intro and then adding it to the segment. The pros there, of course, editorial flexibility. You can then decide you want to tweak the intro, you want it to be slightly different, maybe something has changed. The cons, slightly more time and resources needed for that. So just something to note. Locking up. Stand by.
While we are working on that, actually we have a question that relates specifically to workflow, if we could, while we're working on a little bit of the presentation. Mark Simpson is asking you, Jennifer, if stations used to put time checks in newscasts and are now not doing it for NPR One, where are they putting time checks? Is there any conversation about, what's the deal with taking them out versus keeping them in?
It was something that came up actually. I know there was some discussion around when we changed the clock, and PRPD was talking around, what are some good system solutions we could come up with about how to either edit them in such a way where you could edit that out. That is not something that we have led that discussion. We've talked with different people about individual ideas about letting go of the time check, but we haven't offered up our specific advice as to here are ways to get rid of the time check. So no, I guess I can't, I don't have solutions to offer, although I know some people have looked at it. So I'm happy to, if there are people that have questions, specific questions around that, to forward you on to other people who I know have come up with ideas.
So one of those ideas that just popped in is from Elaine Baumgartel from KUNM, and she notes that at KUNM they have shifted time checks to the top of the hour break, and then at the first half-hour break after the local newscast at the top of the hour. So we've got a lot of great people putting some input in, and this is a great way to collaborate with one another. We'll try to aggregate some of this and share out some of the feedback people are giving to us.
Okay.
All right, we're moving on.
Okay. Is it liking you? We specifically, yeah, okay.
We're just going to keep moving.
Keep moving. Okay. So for this particular part, we have one of the folks who was nice enough to be on my committee talking about workflow was Juliet Fromholt from WISO. And she was one of these people who went through the process of adding one of those intros to the segments outside of the newscast. So Juliet was nice enough to offer to talk to us a little bit about their process there. So Juliet, if you're there, can unmute your phone. We're going to ask if you could come to us really quickly. We're going to unmute you. Hold on. Okay. So Juliet, if you could just tell us a little bit about what you do there at WISO in your newsroom around local segments, kind of how that went from start to finish in a really shortish way, and how you feel like that's worked for you.
Sure. So just to give everybody a sense of our capacity, we are a 4-person news team plus me. Of course, 2 out of those 4 are also hosts, Morning Edition and All Things Considered. So we had to be really careful about not overburdening anyone in hopping onto NPR One. So what our managing editor and I decided is that we would make recording the intros a part of filing a story so that when our reporters were getting their stories edited, when their editor, whoever that may be, somebody else on the news team, signed off on their story, that editor, who would already be in a studio listening to cuts and all that, would then just turn right around, record that intro, and then it was the reporter's responsibility in terms of filing their web component to their story to then, put the intro together with the story audio and get that uploaded to NPR One via Core Publisher. And when we first did it, we really weren't sure if it was going to work. It became part of an exhaustive laundry list of steps that you need to take to file a story here at WISO. But I will say we started that in probably August, and now it's just part of our routine. Nobody thinks it takes any egregious amount of extra time. It's just one other thing you do as part of filing here.
Okay, great. Thanks, Juliet. And I know there's a lot of other stations in the system who are doing it the same way WISO is. So it'd be interesting to hear if others have thoughts around that. Again, it's just one strategy of a couple, but it's one that I've noticed a lot of stations are using. So the other one is around the primary process is really just pulling that segment off the air with the host intro. Who's doing that? Some digital editors, some technical staff. The interesting thing on this front is many of those are not editorial folks who are pulling it off, but some are. So slightly different there. So I put the pros here that the show host introing, is that a little closer to the broadcast experience? Maybe. Doesn't mean that's good or bad, but also that there's no change in editor or reporter workflow. And then, I just put in that cons, there's a little reduced editorial flexibility there, although people often say, we would be willing to change that segment, if there were breaking news and so forth. So just a little bit of distinction there. And so one of the groups that is doing that right now is KOW. And they are pulling their segments off the air with a host intro. And again, many, many people are doing it this way. But Jenna was in our group, was kind enough to offer.
I unmuted her.
to speak to us today about their process. So Jenna, if you want to tell us a little bit about what's going on there.
Sure. So we have a larger newsroom of around 45 people, and we had been posting individual segments from our news magazine on the website for a couple years, and so it wasn't, it didn't interrupt our workflow to put our segments into NPR One, especially since we're digital services clients. So they could work around the back end to pull all of our stories into NPR One. For us, it was more of a learning curve for the newscasters. We were sharing a newscast every 6 or 4 hours, and then I think the spec changed. So that's one piece of advice I would give everyone who wants to participate, is to pay attention to the rules, just like you just went through all of them. And so go to the webinars, follow the rules, because if something changes, it would change your strategy. So we switched after that switch. We started posting our newscast every hour, and our newscaster just trims the front and the end of the file. So it was a low impact on us for the segments. It was a little bit higher impact on the newscast.
Jenna, can you talk a little bit about who does this at your station? Who's the person that's actually doing the work of pulling it off of the air and putting it into NPR One?
Yeah, so our for the news stories are pulled from Morning Edition, and that is done by the newscaster. And then for the news magazine, in the middle of the day, it's the show producer will pull one of the show producers is assigned to doing web audio, and they just go through and they just cut with the beginning and the end, including the host intro, and they drop it in a folder for web staff to upload it and process it. The newscasts are recorded automatically every hour at a certain time. I think it's at the top of the hour, and then the newscaster goes in and trims it, drops it in a folder, and we just have a batch file job that runs every hour that sends it to the FTP for NPR One. So it's a few different people, and like I said, for some it was no problem because it's already in their workflow. Newscasters there's a range of feelings about it. One person thinks it's a pain, and they worry it'll get dropped off during breaking news, which it does. We do miss a few hours during breaking news. Also, if someone is filling in for a newscaster, if we fail to train them on how to do it, it'll get also dropped on those days. But for the most part, the newscasters say they've gotten used to doing it. And what I learned also recently is that they'd like to know how many people are using NPR One. So we'll start sending them stats so that they have a feedback system, so they know that this is a service that's growing. People are listening to it, and it's worth their effort.
Okay, thanks, Jenna. That's great. And there are a lot of people, again, doing it that are taking this approach. Now, I think there's a variety of ways that, staffing and how they're going about it. But for me and my discussions, it seems like these are the two that are most prominent in how people are doing that. So just something to think about when you're strategizing about how to go about it. One thing that came up in our group, which I thought was really interesting, is does it matter who intros? So it's just something when you're considering tweaking workflow or who's going to do what, to ask the question, does it actually matter who reads the intro at your station? And it was brought up that maybe having somebody else read the intro might negatively impact that show's brand or image. I hadn't ever even thought about that. So I thought it was a good question to consider when you're thinking about how do we want to go about this and which way to do it. So talk show segments, I just wanted to end on this part, which is it's something where there's work needed on both sides. And I mean that in that we don't have great recommendations yet as to if you want to chunk up your talk shows, how to go about that that's a good user experience. So right now, some people are including every segment, some aren't including any for fear of a bad listener experience. And the concern there is because some of those intros and outros obviously are talking about either what's coming up next or what we just heard. They're big and long. And that's not to say that some of them aren't working, but it's tough because what we definitely know is that a listener is not going to hear those segments in succession, right? So if you're putting in 4 or 5 different segments, just know that the listener is not going to hear them either in order or probably would not hear all of them if that was your hope. But it's also, really difficult for some of those show segments to truly stand alone without some confusion, and that's a generalization, absolutely. But, the way a lot of people come into those pieces, it's kind of within the context of the show. So not all of them, but we need to do, and I'm on the NPR side, think about what would we recommend or what other things could we test for talk shows. And right now, one of the biggest things we talk about is you certainly can surface the full show as a podcast, which is, of course, searchable in the app, and is a good way for people to get the entire show. So that's just something to consider when we're talking about talk shows, and there's more there that we need to learn and understand from the audience, and that we would be happy to share with you. So now it's on to Janine.
All right. I want to do a little introduction for those of you who may know this lovely voice. Janine Williamson is also our DS support manager who is working hand in hand with stations on their process of getting set up within NPR One. She is a primary conduit, and she's an advocate for stations back into our product development pipeline. And she is deeply and intimately aware of working with stations and understanding your needs as we get through this. Sorry. All right, so sorry about that. All right, sorry about that. We had a little feedback. But I want to hand off to Janine because she's going to walk us through a series of updates that have been made in relationship to NPR One and Station Connect. As you know, Station Connect is the tool that allows you all to kind of manage your branding and some of your sonic IDs, as well as inserting your newscasts into it. And we wanted to talk a little bit about updates that have been made in progression to the tool set. So with that, Janine, take it away.
All right. Thank you, Stephanie. Hi, everyone. So we learned a lot with onboarding and with getting stations using NPR One. A few things we learned. Onboarding, there was some confusion around how to get your content in, specifically about using Station Connect, where to go, how to use it. We also learned a lot about the structure within Station Connect. So the back end, the things that you guys don't see. We learned how to improve that so that when we do things like make updates or changes, there is a faster turnaround time for that, and also it doesn't impact you as much. We also learned a lot about usability and what things we needed to update on the front end to make it easier for stations. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about some updates in the app as well towards the end. So one of the biggest things that we did was simplify onboarding by adding an NPR One section in Station Connect. We also added some information around parent-child configuration and how stations can find which station in Station Connect or which entry is the best one to enter their content in. We have stations that might have multiple entries in Station Connect, and they were confused. Some stations would add everything into one and then not hear it in the app and wonder what was going on. So we wanted to make that easier for stations. So now if you log into Station Connect, you'll actually see a little NPR One icon next to your network entry, and that is the one where you want to add all of your content, and it will actually trickle down. So we did the back end work to make sure that if you add something into your network, it then will go down to your child's entries as well. We also added error messaging and error handling so that you know where to go and what to do. There's help text. There's also autocomplete if you enter in a URL that is not in the correct prefix. Validation for audio, so if you're entering the wrong format for your audio, it won't allow it to get uploaded into the system. Logo and image size format messaging, so if you're putting in the wrong size logo, we will remind you of that. And also just a reminder to save before you walk away from the page. That was a big one that people were having trouble with in the beginning. We also added links to troubleshooting information. We have provided a lot of documentation on our DS website as well as in nprstations.org. And we want stations to know how to find that information. So now you'll find links in Station Connect to specific content. There were also a few defects that we found along the way. There were some issues when logging in. People weren't able to see a login message when we were actually working on it or providing maintenance, so we've added that in. There was also some issues along the way with sonic IDs and your hello messages. There was some issues with certain browsers, so if you were in a certain browser, you might have seen a server not found message, as well as the inability to preview your audio, so you wouldn't know if it was actually in there or not. So we've worked on making sure that those error messages are visible, and if you are in a certain browser, you won't find those same problems anymore. As far as updates in the app team has been working really hard on providing innovation. They're also spending a lot of time reviewing the user data information that we're getting from reports and finding what are the best improvements to make sure that people are actually able to use the app and that they stay engaged. They also have been making improvements for stations so that your station can be found easily, and auto-localization is working better as well. So the team is going to continue to do that. Over the next couple of months, I would make sure that you guys are paying attention to the release notes that we send out. We want to make sure that you guys are getting up to date on what changes are happening, and we'll also be hoping to do some demos in the future as well. So stay tuned for that. I'd also remind you to make sure to check out your station analytics. We do have a dashboard for NPR One in there if you haven't seen it yet. If you have any questions about any of this information, please email us at npr1@ds.npr.org.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So I believe we're transitioning to the question and answer portion of this webinar. Right off the top, we have a quick question that I'm going to ask Asla Banal to help take a shot at. So Asla is the product owner for local content and really helpful in the world of Station Connect and has a lot of experience around audio. So one of the questions we have here is, how are stations encoding their newscasts? Programs used, automated processes needed for suggestion workflow. I know this is a very meaty question, so we can high level it, and we can also follow up with Joseph directly, but if you can just touch on a highlight.
Sure. Hi everybody, my name is Asla Banal. As Stephanie said, I'm the product owner for Station Connect and the local experience. Encoding audio is one of the bigger topics that we have to deal with for newscasts. Since every station has a different setup, different hardware, different software that they use, I've observed many different ways of tackling this. We've even actually created a post around this that you can find on our site. But I'll give you one example. I visited WBUR, and in that station, for example, they take the newscast directly and record it into Pro Tools. And once the newscast is completed, the audio engineer just tops and tails it and drags it into a drop folder, which I think one of our other station folks mentioned earlier, similar to that workflow. So they've actually created a little script that will FTP it to the correct location, and then we just pick it up from there. That is one way to go about it. Another way that you can encode your newscast is once you have the newscast recorded, you can use a tool like FFmpeg. We have recommendations on what settings we would use to do that. And you can even use iTunes to encode it to the format that is accepted by the app. So there's definitely a few ways to go about it. Based on what your configuration is and what your setup is in your station, we could definitely point you to maybe a preferred method for you individually. So this definitely, I think, is a good question to send us.
So with that, I want to direct you to, on the DS website, under the NPR support section, there is a post in which Asla was talking that we've really defined some best practices around workflow that we've had working with stations that have shared with us. In that, if you would like to have a conversation with us specifically related to your station, please send us a request at npr1@ds.npr.org, and we will follow up with you individually to talk to you a little bit about that and understand what software you're using, what automation system you have, because it's an interesting matrix of complexity when it depends on, there really isn't a consistent standardized solution across the entire network. So we need to make sure we're talking to you individually. So send us your questions in. That's a great one. Thank you, Asla. I appreciate you answering that question. Jennifer, I'm going to toss this one to you. This is a subjective question, but ultimately I think it's a great conversation piece. So Chris Sweet is posted here. We're posting the full talk show audio in NPR One, and normally it's about a 15-minute piece of audio. Is that okay?
You know, this might be a good one for Sarah if we want to open up her mic to chime in as well. But what I would say is I think after 12 minutes, it's probably not getting accepted. My worry is there are some hard rules right there that it might not even be accepted by the app. And Sarah, maybe you can speak to that as well. But you know, one of our big, you know, recommendations around that longer audio, again, is to think through what is that experience, that standalone experience, and would it be better served as either something much smaller or really as the entire show as a podcast. And so we're kind of pushing people with that longer, meatier content because people do still want it. They just want it in a different way. And Sarah, maybe you can talk a little bit more about that.
Sure. As Jennifer said earlier in the webinar, we have a 12-minute limit on pieces in the flow. And the national and the local pieces are all time limited at 12 minutes. We have a couple of places in there where we put longer form podcasts, and that's really where and those are podcasts right now that we ingest through the NPR, the way that all the podcasts come in through NPR, which is being changed right now as well separately from NPR One. But if you put something that's 15 minutes long in that slot, it's not going to play back because there's a 12-minute limit.
Okay, great. Thank you, Sarah. Really appreciate that. So here's a great question. And this is actually going to speak to Janine because this is really about getting content into the system. So, pardon me, local segments. What about stations that are not on Core Publisher? How do stations not on Core Publisher get their local segment of content into NPR One?
Great question. Thank you for asking that. I should have mentioned that earlier. We have several ways for stations to participate in NPR One. You do not have to be a Core Publisher user to have your local segmented content added into the app. There are 3 different ways. You can have us give you a CP Lite site, so that is a Core Publisher Lite site where we provide you with access to just the back end, no front end interface, but you can easily upload your audio into CP Lite, and then we can have you have that access. You don't have to do any configuration of the API. You don't have to use your dev resources, or if you don't have any dev resources, you can easily get your content in. There are 2 other options. If you do have dev resources at your station, you can do a API configuration. We can help you with setting that up. It does involve quite a bit of time and resources on your end to do that, so we'd be happy to help you with an API configuration. You also have the option to use a WordPress plugin that we provide. The plugin does have the flag for NPR One inclusion included as well, and we're happy to help you set that up too. So there are a few different ways to do it. If you are interested, please email us at npr1@ds.npr.org, and we can talk through which option is best for you.
Excellent. Thank you, Janine. All right, this question is going to go to Sarah Saracen, so let's make sure her mic is open, please. Sarah, how many local segments stay in the queue? Does that mean that after we load X number of segments, the older and least timely segments get bumped out of the queue by the newer segment? So Sarah, can you speak a little bit about how you organize segments into specific buckets, please?
Sure. A lot of it depends, and this is something that's just very, very different from the radio. A lot of it depends on the individual listener and how long they've been listening and how many of your pieces they've heard, right? Someone can listen a very long time and listen past 10 slots for local content in a single day. That's incredibly rare. And then someone else might only listen for a few minutes and only get the newscast and one story. So it's not that there's things that are in a queue exactly, and different people hear different amounts of content depending on how long they're listening. One thing that you need to keep in mind, though, is that we have a 1-week time limit on all of those pieces. I know that this is not a great solution, and DS right now is building a tool so that you can set an expiration date, But if you put a piece in, it's only going to be heard for a week right now until we can get that sort of better control for you over how long a piece is in there.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Sarah. I appreciate that. All right, next question. We're flipping to a technical question. So Ms. Oslo, we're going to ask her to step over here by our mic and take a peek at it. This is specifically related to why is the newscast format, MP4, different from the core publisher required format, which is 64-bit mono MP3? Any move towards standardization across those platforms?
That's like all questions, that's a really good one. We found that with MP3, because you're now serving audio over a network, it actually could time out when fetching that audio. So MP4 is actually designed specifically for streaming over networks, and so that is why we came with that recommendation. It does actually seem to be the preferred audio format. It's also known as M4A. You'll see it with an M4A extension. It is basically the same thing under the hood, but that is the main reason. It's really just to ensure that you have a smooth streaming experience for your listeners and that audio doesn't get skipped, which can sometimes happen with MP3 in slower connection areas.
Okay, excellent. Thank you for that. This is an interesting question, and frankly, this could be a question that is really station by station specific. And I don't even know, frankly, if we're the ones to have the answers for this one. But I'm going to put it out there because I think it could open up an interesting dialogue, and we'll see who around here would like to have this chat. So it says, is there a benefit to setting up NPR One for each of our stations, regional transmitters, or should we keep just the umbrella station KCBX? For instance, would this help our Santa Barbara listeners get more content related to their geographic area? This is from Randall White. So I would say, Janine, why don't you take this one since you're really working with Station Connect?
That's a great question. We've had this conversation with a few stations individually about their sister stations or their stations that might not be their network station. And we've come up with a few different reasons for it's probably best to use the one that you brand the most. If you do have a local newscast that is, for example, on the Cape, and your bigger network is in Boston, you can create a local newscast for that Cape experience. That's something you can do in Station Connect. If you have a station that is just a repeater and it's not necessarily its own individual content, then you want to stick with that larger network station instead and put your content in Station Connect in that one network area. So it really depends on the station. It's kind of like a station-by-station conversation. So I'd recommend reaching out to us to have that with you.
Yeah, and I'd also like to add, I mean, I think we have to remember this is a digital environment, this is a digital landscape, and repeaters are an excellent as a distribution mechanism across land. And digital is just a difference. So really asking yourself, is the repeater just a repeater to give you more geographic expansion? Well, you don't necessarily have to worry too much about that in the digital space because you can expand just about anywhere. But again, this is really going to come down to what do those repeaters really have as an identity and a content opportunity about giving it its uniqueness. And if it's not necessarily unique, we would recommend sticking at the network level. All right, so I'm going to scroll through a couple of these other questions are coming in. Thank you all. We're 1 minute to go. I'm going to look for one final question just so you know. We will be doing follow-up with some of these questions. There are great resources online at the DS website, so it's ds.npr.org. Also, a lot of the content, most of the content, access to all this content is available through nprstations.org/NPR1. And you can always reach us for help, questions, and support by emailing us at npr1@ds.npr.org. So I'm going to look at this, and so I'm just trying to think of a couple of questions that are really very individualistic. And let's see. All right. So again, a lot of these are very station individually specific, and as we have hit the 4 o'clock hour, we will follow up with you individually for those of you who have questions. I want to take this moment to thank everybody for their participation. Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Janine. Thank you, Juliet and Jenna and Sarah, for joining us today. This has been a wonderful experience. We appreciate your partnership. And you know, what's fascinating is that right now we have about 55 stations that are really actively engaged inside of NPR One, meaning they are putting content into this experience. And we're looking forward to more stations joining us over the next few months. We are here to work with you. We've got lots of ways in which we can help, and we encourage all of you to get on the website, check out this information, work inside your organizations to see if the workflow changes can be less painful and making this a process of engagement much easier for you. With that, I want to thank everybody for your time and attention. Thank you all, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.